The night air was thick, as if the world itself held its breath. In the dim candlelight of his study, Vincent sat hunched over ancient, crumbling tomes, his hands shaking, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights spent searching for a cure. Pages yellowed with age spoke of ancient rituals, forgotten gods and creatures that slithered beneath the veil of the world he knew. He'd spent years slaying demons, wielding his faith and his sword with the certainty of a righteous man. Yet now, sitting before the arcane text, he was a hollowed version of his former self. Isabel's shallow breathing echoed from the adjacent room, a soft, brittle sound that had become a constant reminder of his failure. Every wheeze and cough twisted the knife deeper into his heart. He'd faced creatures beyond the comprehension of most men, stared into the eyes of pure evil. But this, watching his daughter wither away, was more than he could bear. The physicians had no answers. The priests spoke of tests of faith, but their words were hollow, offering nothing but false hope. He'd prayed. God, how he'd prayed. And yet, Isabel remained pale, her body thin as if death were already claiming her in slow, torturous increments. Each day, her frail body grew weaker, her once vibrant eyes now dull with the glaze of encroaching death. Vincent slammed the book shut and rose from his desk, pacing the narrow room like a caged beast. His once broad shoulders were hunched beneath the weight of his burden. A man who had fought demons, driven by the righteousness of his cause, now felt his faith crumbling. He'd slain creatures beyond description, some whose forms twisted reality, yet here he was, powerless against the slow death creeping upon his daughter. His gaze fell upon a tattered journal lying on the desk, the last remnants of a once infamous occultist, a man Vincent had hunted down years ago. At the time, Vincent had thought him insane. But now, as he stood in his study with his heart full of fear, Vincent realized there was no room left for moral certainties, not when Isabel's life hung by a thread. Desperation gnawed at him, and with trembling fingers he reached for the journal, flipping through its pages until his eyes caught the words that both repelled and lured him. The summoning of Malachor. He had known the name before, spoken in dark corners by those too foolish to understand the forces they sought to control. Malachor was no mere demon. He was an ancient thing, a force older than the heavens, a being from the farthest reaches of existence. Men didn't summon Malachor. They survived encounters with him if they were lucky. Yet the ritual was simple. The cost was not. Vincent's eyes lingered on the passage. A single life traded for salvation. 10 years, no more, before the soul is claimed. The words burned into his mind, the simplicity of the offer hiding the true horror beneath. Was this the answer? Could this be the only path left? Vincent's heart pounded, a cold sweat breaking across his brow. He felt the weight of his decision pressing down upon him like the stones of a tomb. His sword, resting on the mantle, seemed distant, useless. He was a demon slayer, a warrior forged in battle. Yet none of that mattered now. He was a father, and a father whose child was dying. And so, as the moon climbed higher in the night sky, Vincent made his choice. The ritual was set. Vincent had drawn the summoning circle in the attic, far from Isabel's room, where she lay unconscious, her breath now barely a whisper. He worked methodically, despite the terror gnawing at his insides. The sigils were drawn in a language not meant for human tongues, symbols older than time itself. Candles burned with an unnatural flame, their light flickering as if the very air recoiled from the ritual. As Vincent finished the final symbol, he stood at the center of the circle, his heart pounding in his chest. The final incantation was on his lips, a phrase so alien that it twisted in his mouth, warping his thoughts as he forced the words into the air. The room grew colder. The shadows in the corners lengthened, twisting and contorting in ways no shadow should. The candles sputtered, their flames guttering as if choked by the darkness now seeping into the room. Then, from the deepest part of the shadows, he appeared. Malachor. Vincent had prepared himself for the demon's arrival, but nothing could have braced him for the reality of it. Malachor did not step into the room. He became the room. The space warped around him, reality bending under the weight of his presence. His form was not one Vincent's eyes could easily comprehend, a mass of writhing shadows, too many eyes, limbs that existed one moment and vanished the next, as if the demon were only half in this world and the rest lost to some incomprehensible void. A voice like the grind of ancient stone echoed in Vincent's mind. "You summon me, mortal. What do you offer?" Vincent's voice wavered, barely more than a whisper. "My soul, in 10 years, spare my daughter, save her." For a moment the room was silent, the air so still it felt like time itself had paused. Then the sound of low, dark laughter rippled through the room, a noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Your soul, and in return I grant you 10 years of peace. Your daughter will live, but after those 10 years, I shall return to claim what is mine." Malachor's form shifted, his eyes, too many eyes, fixed on Vincent with a hunger that transcended the physical. "Do you accept this bargain, Vincent?" Vincent swallowed, the weight of the decision crashing down on him. The desperation in his heart screamed louder than the warnings in his mind. Slowly he nodded. The demon extended a shadowy limb, brushing it across Vincent's hand, cold as the void. A searing pain shot through Vincent's body as a mark, dark and twisted, burned itself into his flesh. The pact was sealed, and just as quickly as Malachor had appeared, the shadows receded. The room returned to its normal state, as if nothing had happened at all. The candles burned steadily once more. The chill vanished, leaving only Vincent standing alone, the weight of his decision settling over him like a shroud. From the next room he heard a sound that filled his heart with both hope and dread. Isabel's soft, steady breathing. Alive. But somewhere, lurking in the depths of Vincent's soul, was the knowledge that in 10 years, Malachor would return. And this time, Vincent would not be the one to choose who paid the price. For 10 years, peace reigned over Vincent's home. Yet it was not the kind of peace that brings relief. It was a hollow, fragile thing, tainted by the knowledge of what loomed on the horizon. Every breath Vincent took was tinged with dread. Every moment of happiness with Isabel was soured by the secret that gnawed at his mind, the demon's return, inevitable as death. Yet, to the outside world, Vincent appeared a man who had found redemption. The once warrior, who had spent his life hunting the unnatural, now lived quietly with his daughter in their small village, a man whose days of fighting evil seemed long past. The change was sudden but welcomed by the community. They spoke of Vincent's transformation with reverence, admiring how he had settled into a life of peaceful contentment. Isabel thrived. The illness that had ravaged her young body left no trace. She grew strong and radiant, her laughter filling the home that once echoed only with despair. Her every smile was a reminder to Vincent of the bargain he had struck. Her presence was both his greatest joy and deepest torment, for every time he looked into her bright eyes, he saw the shadow of Malachor standing behind her, waiting. In the early years, Vincent allowed himself moments of happiness. Isabel's recovery was miraculous, her health restored as though the sickness had never touched her. They spent long days in the garden, tending to the flowers that Isabel had always loved as a child. In those moments, when she laughed and ran through the sun-dappled fields, Vincent could almost convince himself that perhaps, somehow, he would find a way out of the bargain. But those moments of peace never lasted long. At night, the shadows in his mind stirred. The candles in his study flickered unnaturally, as if some unseen presence breathed upon their flames. Vincent would wake in a cold sweat, the weight of the pact suffocating him. The nightmares were vivid. He dreamt of Malachor, his voice like distant thunder, reminding Vincent of the time slipping through his fingers. In these visions, the demon loomed large, his form stretching across the sky, casting the world into shadow. His voice echoed in Vincent's skull. 10 years, mortal, 10 years. The dread grew with each passing day. The knowledge that Malachor would return never left him, a parasite feeding on his every thought. Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that the demon was watching, even in the moments when he was alone with Isabel, her laughter ringing in the air. The closer he became to his daughter, the more unbearable the weight of the bargain grew. By the 5th year, Vincent had begun to seek out a way to break the pact. He knew the danger. He had faced enough evil in his life to understand that nothing made by demons could be undone without consequence. But desperation was a hungry thing. The more he researched, the more he realized how little he knew about the forces he had tangled with. He had once been a demon slayer, a man of conviction, sure in his knowledge of right and wrong, light and darkness. Now, standing on the precipice of damnation, he realized that those certainties were childish illusions. The texts he had once shunned became his lifeline. He pored over ancient scrolls, forbidden grimoires, and dusty tomes that spoke of rituals far darker than anything he had ever imagined. The knowledge was intoxicating, though it came at a cost. His hands, once steady with the weight of a sword, now trembled as he traced the strange sigils of forgotten magic. Every night he read by candlelight, his mind descending deeper into places no man should wander. He sought out scholars, mystics, and charlatans, traveling to distant lands in search of answers. Yet every lead brought him closer to despair. There were no loopholes, no broken seals, no hidden rites. No demon, once summoned, could be dismissed without a price far greater than Vincent had already paid. And always the same warning repeated in every text, every whispered legend. You cannot outsmart the ancient ones. They play games with your soul. His failure gnawed at him. Isabel, growing into a vibrant young woman, could sense the changes in him. Her father, once her protector and hero, was becoming a shadow of the man she had known. He spent days locked in his study, refusing to share his thoughts, pushing her away whenever she tried to reach out. He rarely smiled now, his face a mask of weariness, as though he were carrying a burden too heavy to bear. "What is happening to you?" Isabel asked him one evening, her voice soft but laced with concern. "You've changed, Father. You're not the same. I barely see you anymore." Vincent, sitting by the fire, didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the flickering flames, as though searching for answers in the dancing shadows. "There are things you cannot understand, Isabel, things I cannot explain. You are better off not knowing." "But I want to understand," she insisted. "You don't have to face whatever this is alone." Her words pierced him, but he hardened his heart against them. He couldn't let her in. If she knew the truth, she would hate him. She would fear him. And worse, she would realize that the price of her life had already been set. That realization was a terror far worse than anything Vincent had faced in his days as a demon slayer. "You need to focus on your own life, Isabel," he said, his voice colder than he intended. "You're young. You have a future ahead of you. Don't worry about me." Isabel's eyes searched his face for a long moment before she sighed, her expression one of sorrow and resignation. "You're wrong, Father. I already worry about you. Every day." She left him there, alone with his thoughts, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. As the years passed, Vincent's search for a way to break the pact became an obsession. The looming deadline haunted his every waking moment. In the 9th year, his attempts grew more reckless. He delved into the darkest of magics, brushing against forces that made him question his very sanity. Visions plagued him, glimpses of a future where the world crumbled under the weight of Malachor's return. He saw his own soul, twisted and corrupted, burning in the void. The demon's laughter echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of the price he had agreed to pay. By the time the 10th year arrived, Vincent had become a shell of the man he once was. His eyes, once sharp with purpose, were now hollow and dark. His body, once strong, was now gaunt and wasted from sleepless nights and the toll of forbidden magic. Every attempt to break the pact had failed, leaving him more desperate, more broken. The peace he had bought with Isabel's life was a lie, a thin veneer stretched over a soul that had long since begun to crumble. And yet Isabel flourished. She was strong, beautiful, full of life and promise. She had grown into a woman who deserved a future, free from the darkness that had consumed her father. But Vincent knew that her future, like his, was bound in chains forged by Malacor's will. The final days crept closer, each one passing with a weight that pressed on Vincent's chest like a stone. The village, unaware of the horror that awaited, continued its quiet existence. They did not see the darkening circles under Vincent's eyes, or the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. They did not hear the whispers that slithered through his mind at night, reminding him of the approaching end. 10 years had passed since the night Vincent made his bargain. 10 years of peace that now felt like a cruel joke. And on the horizon, the demon stirred. The night had come. Vincent knew it before the sun set, long before the first stars appeared in the sky. He felt it in the air, in the unnatural stillness that had settled over the village, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The wind didn't stir, the birds were silent, and even the distant murmur of the forest seemed to shrink away from the approaching darkness. It was as if all of creation knew what was coming. Malacor was returning. Vincent sat alone in his study, his hands resting heavily on the desk where once he had searched for answers, now only cluttered with broken dreams and unanswered prayers. The dim light from a single candle flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced in the corners of the room. He hadn't slept in days, the weight of his failure suffocating him as the hours slipped through his fingers. Isabel's laughter echoed faintly in the house, the sound twisting the knife deeper into his heart. He had tried, God, how he had tried. 10 years of desperate research, dark rituals, and forbidden magic, all to escape a fate he had brought upon himself. But nothing had worked. Every incantation, every spell, every whispered bargain with those who claimed to know the secrets of the ancient demons, it had all come to nothing. Now, on the night when his time had run out, Vincent realized that there had never been any hope. The pact was ironclad. The demon would come, and he would take what was his. Vincent's soul. He glanced down at his hand, at the mark that had been seared into his flesh the night he made the pact. The dark, twisting sigil had remained hidden beneath his gloves all these years, a reminder of the deal he had struck. Now it burned with a cold fire, the skin around it pale and lifeless, as if the demon's touch had begun to claim him already. The silence was unbearable. The house felt like a tomb, cold and still. Vincent's pulse quickened as the darkness outside thickened, as though the world itself was preparing for something terrible. Then, as if on cue, the wind picked up, sudden and violent, rattling the windows. The candle on Vincent's desk flickered wildly, casting frantic shadows across the room. His heart pounded in his chest. He could feel it. Malacor was near. The demon had crossed the threshold between worlds, and now there was no escaping his return. But Vincent wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. In his last moments of despair, just weeks before this night, he had discovered something, a fragment of an old forbidden text he had overlooked. In that forgotten corner of an ancient grimoire, he found a loophole, buried beneath layers of cryptic language and dark warnings. It was his only chance, a terrible one, but a chance nonetheless. The text claimed that a demon could be denied its claim on a soul if a substitute were offered in its place. Not just any soul, but one that was innocent, pure, untainted by the dark forces of the world. A sacrifice to satisfy the demon's hunger. Vincent's mind had raced when he first read it, and now, sitting in his study with the night closing in, the full weight of the revelation crashed over him. He could still save himself, but to do so he would have to offer up an innocent like Isabel. The thought twisted in his gut, a sickening, unbearable weight. He stood abruptly, knocking over the chair as he stumbled back, as if the very idea would poison him if he allowed it to stay. Not her. Never her. He'd made this bargain to save her, to give her life. The thought of taking that life from her, of offering her to the demon, was unthinkable. His mind rebelled against it, his heart screaming with fury at the mere suggestion. But the words in the book echoed in his mind, louder now, relentless. The only way out. Outside, the wind howled, the shadows deepening. Vincent could feel the demon's approach like a stain spreading through the night. The weight of Malacor's presence pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. The pact was coming due. Vincent's breaths came shallow and ragged, his thoughts twisted and spiraled, his desperation clawing at him, dragging him deeper into the abyss. He had spent 10 years trying to find a way out. 10 years to save himself, to save Isabel. And now, in these final moments, he stood on the edge of damnation with no other options. The realization hit him like a dagger to the chest. There was no other way. He had tried everything and nothing had worked. The only way to break the pact was to offer the demon something greater than himself, something pure, something innocent. Isabel. His knees buckled and he sank to the floor, hands clutching at his hair, pulling in wild frustration and grief. How could he even consider it? The girl he had watched grow up, the child he had saved, the reason he had made this deal in the first place. She was everything to him. And yet, the clock was ticking down, the darkness swallowing the light outside. Vincent clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. The demon's laughter echoed in his mind, a reminder of the fate that awaited him if he failed. He saw the vision of Malacor standing over him, dragging his soul into an eternity of torment, leaving Isabel alone in a world without her father. If I do this, he thought, she'll never know. She won't feel it. It was a lie he told himself to push through the agony, a desperate justification, born of madness. Vincent stood, trembling but resolute. He didn't have time. He had to act now. Isabel sat by the hearth, reading by the fire's glow, unaware of the storm brewing outside. When Vincent entered the room, his face pale and gaunt, she looked up with concern. "Father, are you all right? You look ill." Vincent forced a smile, but his lips felt numb. "I'm fine, Isabel. I need you to come with me." She frowned, closing her book and standing. "Where? It's late. What's going on?" Vincent's throat tightened. He could barely speak the words. "I need to protect you. There's something I have to do, but you must trust me." Isabel looked at him, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Father, you're scaring me." Vincent turned away, unable to meet her gaze. He led her upstairs to the attic, the place where he had first summoned Malacor all those years ago. The room was dark, colder than the rest of the house, and Isabel hesitated at the threshold. "What is this?" Vincent stepped inside, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He knelt on the floor, his hands trembling as he drew the symbols he had sworn he would never use again. But there was no other choice. Isabel's voice was soft, confused. "Father, what are you doing?" "I'm sorry," Vincent whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." Before she could react, he began the incantation. The words slipped from his lips, cold and alien, twisting the air around them. Isabel cried out, rushing toward him, but as the ritual reached its crescendo, an unseen force held her in place. Her eyes widened in terror, but she couldn't move, couldn't scream. The shadows in the room thickened, coiling around her, drawing closer. Vincent's breath hitched as he continued the chant, his heart breaking with every word. He couldn't stop now. He was too far gone. And then the room went silent. From the darkness, Malachor emerged. The demon's form was even more terrible than Vincent remembered. The shadows writhed and shifted, eyes blinking in and out of existence, limbs twisting into shapes that defied logic. Malachor towered over them, his voice a low, rumbling thunder that reverberated through the very foundation of the house. "You have called me, Vincent." The air was thick with power, the walls of reality bending under the weight of the demon's presence. Vincent stood, shaking, as Malachor's many eyes fixed on him, then slowly shifted to Isabel, still frozen in place. "And you have brought me a gift." Vincent's heart clenched. He couldn't breathe. "I offer her in my place," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Spare me. Take her." Malachor was silent for a long moment, the shadows pulsing with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Then he laughed, a deep, hollow sound that filled the room with dread. "Ah, Vincent, you poor, broken fool. Did you really think I would honor such a bargain?" Vincent's blood ran cold. "There was no loophole," Malachor said, his voice dripping with cruel amusement. "There never was. I wanted you to believe there was. I wanted you to bring me your daughter, to offer her willingly. And now, your soul is mine. Hers too." Vincent's knees buckled. No, but it was too late. The pact was sealed. The shadows closed in, swallowing both him and Isabel, and Malachor smiled. The darkness swallowed everything. There was no sky, no earth, no horizon. Vincent stood in an endless void, a place where time had no meaning, and space itself was distorted beyond comprehension. He could feel it, the weight of eternity pressing down on him, a suffocating blanket of oblivion. His body trembled, though he could no longer tell where his flesh ended and the nothingness began. His heart pounded, but the sound was faint, distant, as though it belonged to someone else. He was no longer in the world of the living. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of decay and sulfur, a reminder of the demon's presence. All around him, the darkness pulsed, alive with unseen eyes watching him, as if the void itself was sentient, amused by his suffering. And somewhere within that endless blackness, Malachor waited, his terrible laughter echoing in the far reaches of Vincent's mind, a reminder of the final, cruel twist. There was no loophole. There never was. The truth was like a knife twisting in his chest. Vincent had damned himself. His last, desperate act to save his own soul had done nothing but seal his fate, and Isabel's. He had sacrificed his daughter, the one person he loved more than anything, believing that it would save them both. But it had been a lie, a grotesque joke played by a being beyond human comprehension, a force of evil that reveled in Vincent's downfall. Isabel. The thought of her name shattered him. She was here, somewhere in this infinite abyss, trapped because of him. He had offered her, his innocent child, to the demon. And now both their souls were bound to this place, prisoners of Malachor's cruel amusement for all eternity. He collapsed to his knees, his body trembling as waves of grief and horror washed over him. His hands clawed at the empty air, but there was nothing to hold on to, nothing to fight. There were no more battles, no more enemies to defeat, no more magic to wield, just the eternal silence of damnation. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice ragged, barely audible in the vast emptiness. "I'm so sorry. I failed you. A sound cut through the void, software familiar. A faint whisper. Vincent froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned, searching the shadows, his heart pounding with a terrible hope. It was impossible, yet he had heard it. He knew he had heard it. Isabel. His voice cracked as he called out, his hands shaking. The darkness shifted, writhing like a living thing, and from within its depths a shape began to emerge. Slowly, painfully, it moved toward him, a flicker of something pale, delicate, something that did not belong in this hellish place. Isabel. She stepped into view, her form fragile and ghostly in the void. Her eyes, once full of life, were dull, haunted by the same endless darkness that had consumed him. She was no longer the vibrant young woman she had been before. Her spirit was fractured, broken, and hollow. Vincent's heart shattered anew. No, this can't be. He stumbled toward her, his hands reaching out, desperate to touch her, to pull her back, but she recoiled from him, her expression blank, devoid of recognition. Isabel, it's me. It's your father. His words faltered as her gaze met his, and what he saw in her eyes was not the warmth or love of his daughter, but something cold, empty, a reflection of the void itself. Father, she whispered, her voice a hollow echo. Why did you do this? The question struck him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He staggered back, the weight of his guilt crushing him beneath its enormity. I thought it would save you. I was trying to protect you. I didn't know. I didn't know the truth. Her eyes bore into him, lifeless and filled with something far worse than hatred, disappointment, betrayal. You lied to me, she said softly, her voice distant as though it came from another world. You took my life. Vincent fell to his knees again, his hands trembling. I'm sorry, Isabel, I'm so sorry. I thought it was the only way. I thought... You condemned me, she interrupted, her words cutting through him like shards of ice. You gave me to him. Tears streamed down Vincent's face, though in this place they fell into nothingness, swallowed by the void. He couldn't look at her, couldn't bear the sight of what she had become because of his actions. I was a fool, he whispered, his voice choked with grief. I was a coward. I thought I could outsmart him, but I was wrong. I was so wrong. For a long moment there was silence. Isabel stood before him, her form flickering, the light in her fading as the darkness pressed in on all sides. Vincent could feel Malicor's presence surrounding them, watching, waiting for him to break. And then the final cruelty. The shadows deepened, coiling around Isabel like tendrils, pulling her back into the abyss. Her expression never changed, but her eyes, hollow and accusing, stayed locked on Vincent until the very last moment, until she was swallowed by the void once more. Isabel, he screamed, lunging forward, but it was too late. She was gone. Again. Gone forever. The void closed in around Vincent, tighter now, suffocating, as though the darkness itself sought to consume the last remnants of his soul. He collapsed, gasping for breath, though there was no air left to draw in. Malicor's laughter filled the emptiness, that low, guttural rumble of amusement that made Vincent's skin crawl. You have nothing left, Vincent, the demon's voice boomed, echoing from all directions. Your daughter, your soul, your hope, all belong to me now. Vincent's hands clawed at the ground, though it was not ground at all, just endless black. His chest heaved as he screamed into the void, his voice a raw, broken thing. Damn you, Malicor. Take me, take whatever you want, but leave her out of this. Malicor's laughter grew louder, more mocking, as if Vincent's pleas were nothing more than a delightful game to him. This is what you chose, mortal. This is the price you pay for your arrogance. Did you think you could defy me? That you could cheat your fate? Vincent's body trembled, his mind unraveling under the weight of the demon's words. He was a fool who had believed in the illusion of hope, who had dared to think he could escape the clutches of something ancient and incomprehensible. "I was wrong," Vincent whispered, his voice hoarse. "I was wrong." The void pulsed with Malakor's power, a dark tide that swept over Vincent, pulling him deeper, crushing him under its weight. He could feel himself being torn apart, piece by piece, his soul unraveling into the darkness, and yet the demon's voice remained, omnipresent, eternal. "You are mine now, Vincent. You and your daughter both. There is no end for you, no peace, only this. Forever." In the final moments of Vincent's existence, as his consciousness began to slip away, he thought of Isabel one last time. He saw her face, not as it had been in the void, but as it had been before, the bright, innocent girl he had tried to save. He clung to that image, even as the darkness swallowed him whole, even as Malakor's laughter echoed in his mind. He held on to her memory, the only thing he had left, as the last remnants of his soul dissolved into the eternal night. And then there was nothing but the void, forever.